When we talk about the horrors of Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge, most people focus on the brutality of Pol Pot and his regime. But what's often left out of the conversation is just how deeply China was involved in shaping, supporting, and sustaining that nightmare. The fingerprints of Beijing are all over Cambodia's tragedy, not just as a distant ideological influence but as an active, hands-on partner in one of the 20th century's darkest chapters. To truly understand what happened in Cambodia, you have to look beyond the killing fields and mass graves and trace the lines of power and ideology that ran straight from Mao Zedong's China to Pol Pot's Cambodia. This wasn't just a case of China cheering from the sidelines. Mao Zedong himself, the architect of the Chinese Communist Revolution, took a personal interest in Cambodia's radical experiment. He saw in Pol Pot a kindred spirit, a leader willing to push Maoist ideas to their most extreme, no matter the human cost. The relationship between the two regimes was built on more than just shared ideology. It was a partnership forged in blood, revolution, and a shared vision of remaking society from the ground up. What's especially chilling is that even as Pol Pot's regime began targeting Cambodia's ethnic Chinese population, people who, on paper, should have been protected by their ties to Beijing, China looked the other way. The suffering of ethnic Chinese in Cambodia was ignored, sacrificed on the altar of revolutionary purity and geopolitical strategy. For Beijing, the fate of ordinary people mattered less than the success of the Khmer Rouge experiment. Pol Pot's connection to China began long before the Khmer Rouge seized power. In the 1960s, he traveled to Beijing and witnessed firsthand the chaos and violence of the Cultural Revolution. He saw Red Guards storming through the streets, denouncing teachers, burning books, and purging so-called class enemies. He watched as history was rewritten, families torn apart, and brutality justified in the name of ideology. For Pol Pot, this was not a warning, it was an inspiration. He took Mao's vision of class struggle and decided to push it even further, to create a society where not just class but ethnicity, culture, and even memory itself could be erased in the pursuit of revolutionary purity. When Pol Pot returned to Cambodia, he brought with him the lessons of Maoist China, but he twisted them into something even more monstrous. Where Mao had targeted landlords, intellectuals, and counter-revolutionaries, Pol Pot expanded the definition of the enemy to include entire ethnic groups, religious communities, and anyone who stood in the way of his vision. The result was a campaign of terror that left nearly 2 million Cambodians dead, killed by starvation, forced labor, torture, and execution. The Khmer Rouge didn't just try to eliminate class enemies, they tried to erase the very idea of Cambodia's past, its culture, and its people. But Pol Pot's revolution would never have been possible without China's support. When the Khmer Rouge seized power in 1975, Beijing became their lifeline. Over the next 4 years, China poured more than $1 billion into Cambodia, an astronomical sum at the time. They sent military advisors to train Khmer Rouge soldiers, shipped in crates of weapons and ammunition, and provided technical expertise on everything from agriculture to propaganda. Chinese engineers helped build roads and infrastructure, while Maoist doctrine shaped the policies that would devastate the country. This was not just ideological support, it was material, logistical, and deeply personal. Chinese generals didn't just offer advice from afar. They were on the ground, training Pol Pot's troops in the tactics of guerrilla warfare and political indoctrination. The rifles used in mass executions were stamped with Chinese markings. The uniforms worn by Khmer Rouge soldiers were modeled after those of the Red Guards. Even the slogans painted on the walls of Cambodian villages echoed the language of Mao's Cultural Revolution. In every corner of the Khmer Rouge regime you could see the imprint of Chinese support. The relationship between China and the Khmer Rouge was not just one of inspiration, it was one of enablement. Without Chinese money, weapons, and expertise, the Khmer Rouge would have struggled to maintain their grip on power. Beijing's support gave Pol Pot the confidence to push his policies to their most extreme, knowing that he had the backing of one of the world's most powerful communist states. In many ways, China didn't just inspire the Khmer Rouge, they made them possible. But here's the chilling part, the part that's often left out of history books and official narratives. Even as the Khmer Rouge began turning on Cambodia's ethnic Chinese minority, Beijing continued to support the regime. The logic was cold and ruthless. The revolution mattered more than the lives of individual Chinese people. For Mao and his inner circle, the fate of overseas Chinese was secondary to the success of the revolutionary project. In 1977, As paranoia and violence within the Khmer Rouge reached new heights, Pol Pot ordered the systematic purging of Cambodia's ethnic Chinese. Entire neighborhoods were emptied, families were rounded up, and thousands were executed or sent to labor camps. The very people who, in theory, should have been protected by their connection to China, became targets of suspicion and hatred. The regime accused them of being bourgeois, of hoarding wealth, of being enemies of the revolution. In reality, they were scapegoats, victims of a system that valued ideology over humanity. The impact was devastating. Cambodia's ethnic Chinese population, once a vibrant and integral part of the country's economy and culture, was cut in half almost overnight. Some were starved to death, others executed, and many more forced to hide their identities or flee the country. The streets of Phnom Penh, once bustling with life, became ghostly and silent. Refugee camps swelled with the emaciated and traumatized survivors of the Khmer Rouge's purges. What's even more disturbing is that internal Chinese government documents, declassified years later, reveal that Mao and his top officials were not only aware of what was happening, they actively encouraged it. In their eyes, the overseas Chinese were seen as potential threats, as remnants of the old bourgeois order that needed to be eliminated for the revolution to succeed. The suffering of their own people was justified in the name of class struggle and ideological purity. In the twisted logic of Maoist ideology, class war always trumped ethnicity. Being Chinese offered no protection if you were seen as an enemy of the revolution. The same forces that had torn through China during the Cultural Revolution were now unleashed on Cambodia, with even more devastating consequences. Ordinary people, farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, became targets not because of what they had done, but because of who they were, or what they represented in the eyes of the regime. The nightmare finally began to end in 1979, when Vietnam invaded Cambodia and toppled the Khmer Rouge regime. Vietnamese tanks rolled into Phnom Penh, bringing an end to 4 years of terror. For many Cambodians, the arrival of Vietnamese troops was both a liberation and a new occupation, but it marked the collapse of Pol Pot's genocidal experiment. China, furious at the loss of its client state and the humiliation of seeing its revolutionary project destroyed, retaliated by launching a brief but bloody invasion of Vietnam. Tens of thousands of Chinese soldiers died in the conflict, fighting to defend a regime that had just murdered thousands of ethnic Chinese. The irony was staggering, but for Beijing, geopolitics and revolutionary loyalty mattered more than the lives of their own people. Even after the genocide was exposed to the world, China continued to fight for the Khmer Rouge on the international stage. For years, Beijing lobbied to keep Pol Pot's representatives in Cambodia's seat at the United Nations, blocking efforts to recognize the new Vietnamese-backed government. The world watched in disbelief as the architects of genocide were given a voice in the halls of global power, all because of China's determination to protect its interests and its revolutionary legacy. In the end, geopolitics mattered more than human lives. The suffering of millions was weighed against the strategic interests of great powers and found wanting. The story of China's role in Cambodia is a reminder that ideology, when combined with power and ambition, can lead to unimaginable cruelty, and that the victims are often forgotten in the rush to rewrite history. In Mao's world, loyalty to the revolution outweighed everything else, even the blood of their own people. The legacy of that loyalty can still be felt today, in the scars left on Cambodia, in the silence of those who survived, and in the lessons that history has yet to fully reckon with. If you want to understand the true cost of ideology, and the hidden hands that shape history's darkest moments, keep watching. Subscribe for more untold stories from the shadows of the past.